So my module was the bookings module from Airbnb. And so what this allows you to do is select a check-in date, a checkout date. It allows you to add a number of guests, either like adult, children, or infant type. And so what it'll do is if I select like the 23rd, and then if I select like the 25th, for instance, it'll highlight the dates that I'm staying at this particular place. And it'll also generate the total cost. And so it'll figure out the amount of days in between these two dates, multiply it by the initial price, and then it'll also add these additional like fees that I am randomly generating currently, and it'll generate a total. So I'll talk briefly about the endpoint that I'm using on my back end. I have this array of unavailable dates, and I'm using this to, if you look in my calendar and go to like the next month, for instance, that date's grayed out because it's in the unavailable dates array. And these dates are also grayed out because they're unavailable, and so on. So you get like a number of unavailable dates because that's typically how it is on the website. If the hotel is booked, then it gets grayed out. These dates get grayed out. I also have like an initial price, cleaning service, and taxes numbers in my database that I'm using. There are things that I thought I would use and I ended up not using them. But the main things that I'm using are initial price, cleaning service, and taxes, and the unavailable dates array. And so I'll step into my React code and talk about how I separated this all out into components. So this right here is separated out into its own component. And so I have a main like app component, and this is what I'm calling React.render on. In my return, I wrap all this in a div for CSS. And then I have this cost component, and I pass the initial cost into the cost component. And so all that is doing is it's formatting the cost in a particular way. So it looks like what's on Airbnb. So the per night is small, the actual price is pretty large. Then I also have dates component, and the dates component is actually pretty complicated. The dates component is all of this right here. I think I can annotate maybe. Annotate. Yeah, this is my dates component. And that contains, I'll go into it, quite a bit of stuff. So there's some conditional rendering for when I click on check-in. This is initially check-in, but when I click on a date, it switches to the actual date and displays the date. And the same applies for the checkout. And so that's about all there is. So I have a toggle functionality for the calendars. The calendar is its own separate component. I think that's the most complicated part of the front end that I've done. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But basically, when I click on a date, it toggles the calendar and shows the calendar. So I think I'll go into the calendar. I'll talk about maybe the props that I'm passing in a bit once I give a high-level overview of how I'm doing the calendar. And so the way that I do the calendar is I use a library called moment.js, and that's how I get the first day of the month, what weekday it starts on. That's really important because I need to know um, which day to start on. And so, like October starts on a Tuesday, and so the first is on a Tuesday. Sunday and Monday are all just empty, which is what I want. Um, and I actually do that logic in um, let's see, in my render weeks function in calendar. Um, and so what I have is I have this month array, and the month array ultimately is going to have it's going to be an array of arrays, and so it's going to have the amount of weeks in a month. And so, like the first week, I have this like start of month day, which is variable where I store the day for the start of the month, the weekday in particular. And then I have this days and month variable where I store the amount of days in the month. And so I have like I initialize this week array, and then I push like empty strings into this week array until I arrive at the start of the month. Uh, and it's at that point where I push actual numbers into the week array. And once that's finished with once it's finished with the first week, then I can just focus on only pushing numbers into the week array and pushing that into my month array. And so that's sort of how I generate the weeks. Um, so for anything other than the start of the month, I'm just taking the day after the here, I'll go to this for more of a visual. So like after the 26th, after the 5th, for instance, um, I would start on the 6th. And then I would just generate like 7 numbers here. And then I would move on to the next week and generate 7 numbers there. And then to the next week and generate 7 numbers there. And then I do a conditional where if it's like, let's see, um, I loop through the amount of days in the month. And that's how I stop. So like the reason it's sort of like cut off at the 31st and there's no like extra boxes that are being generated is because I'm only looping up to the 31st. I'm not generating any like empty strings here. The reason there's boxes here is because I'm putting in empty strings. So anyways, once I have this array of arrays where I have this month array with weeks arrays, I store that in state. And so that then allows me to map through each week. And I then have a week component, which I'll get into. And I pass in a lot of things into the week component. I pass in unavailable dates, which I think I initially passed into app.jsx because that's where I'm doing my get request and component did mount. And I pass that into dates, which I then pass into calendar, which I then pass into week. And then I also have like check in and check out, and calendar type is important because that allows me to identify like which calendar to actually change. And then get date. And so the most important thing that I'm passing in is dates, where I'm passing in a week array. I'll go into this weak component. So there's a lot of stuff that I did here to fix some bugs that I ran into, but the main concept was I'm mapping over each date in this .props.dates. So I then pass that into a render date function, and there's a bunch of conditionals where, if this is true, then return this type of CSS, or if this is true, then add a click handler to this number. And so, like, for instance, if it's past the 22nd, then all dates prior to the 22nd are going to be grayed out, and I can't click on them or interact with them at all. But if it is like the 23rd, for instance, and I haven't clicked on the 23rd yet, I should be able to click on that. And I can also like change like which date or which dates I'm staying at. And so like there's like a conditional where I have like a function that determines whether or not a number is in between the dates that I've clicked on. And if it is, then it'll turn it blue. And so that is how I get the blue text to, or not the blue text, but the blue boxes to be displayed. And I don't want to go into all of this because it would take quite a while. But there's also some like error or some bugs that I had to fix where, like, if it was the 25th, for instance, and I clicked on checkout, I shouldn't be able to click on the 23rd. And you can see I'm clicking on the 23rd and nothing's happening, which is what I want. So that's the bulk of the calendar. The guest component was pretty easy. This is just stuff that I store in the state of my main app, and then I pass down and as a prop into my guest component. It updates to 7 guests. I'll talk about the info component. So inside of info.jsx, I have this component that gets conditionally rendered based on whether or not both dates are displayed. And so this dates between function checks how many dates are in between the dates that I've selected. And so that way I can display like this .props.initial, so the initial cost, and I can multiply that by invoking this dates between function. And that's how I display the initial price multiplied by the amount of nights. And then for like total, I would just add everything up to display a total. So I display the cost, the initial cost times the amount of nights plus the amount of money for the service and for cleaning and then for taxes. And so yeah, so if check-in is an empty string and checkout is an empty string, then or is not an empty string, sorry. If it's not an empty string, it means the dates are filled in. So then I display this component. Otherwise, I just return an empty string, so it displays nothing. So that's pretty much everything for my project. It was really challenging. CSS was a bit of an issue initially. I had things or all of the CSS into like JavaScript objects, which I feel was kind of limiting, as opposed to just using like regular CSS. So I had to figure out like what dependencies to take in CSS loader and style loader, and I put that into my Webpack, so that way I could use actual CSS, which was nice. That's about it.